and then go in again. Okay, now we're ready. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again for inviting me to give this key talk. I'm very honored to do that, and I hope you will enjoy it. So my talk is about the point of view of paleobiology into the origin and early evolution of the biospheres. Next slide. So recently, two reviews make very important points regarding the origin of life studies. Mariska et al. Insisted on the importance to take into account the hidden concepts in the history and philosophy of origin of life studies that differ depending on the kind of explanations we want to propose for the origin of life. Some of these explanations follow universal. They try to explain how we go from what are the different steps from lifeless world to living worlds. Other explanations are historical. They are the explanation for life on Earth. So we went from a lifeless Earth to Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and we can expand to, we went to microbial life in the three domains of life and even eukaryogenesis. And other explanation are synthetic and try to explain, to imagine other paths of life in the universe, or even paths explanation that are challenging the universal explanations. The other review is by Preiner et al., and they insist on the importance to bridge disciplines and to connect the formerly opposing views between regarding the origin of life studies, such as the top-down versus bottom-up approach, or the metabolic first versus the RNA world approach. Next slide. So the topics chosen by ESOL this year are really doing a great job covering and bridging disciplines. I put there around this figure the different titles of the sessions. Next slide. And I think my expertise in this is paleobiology, which explore all aspects of the history of life and the biospheres. And I think paleobiology is something to bring to all the different topics. Like paleobiology is trying to characterize the morphological and chemical biosignatures of life, and it provides calibration points for molecular clocks. It can document old fossil lipids and early metabolism. It also studies the role of minerals to produce, for example, biomorphs that are abiotic minerals that mimic lives and produce pseudo-signature of life, or minerals as sources of elements for metabolism, redox reactions, or habitats for early life. Studying the geological context of the early Earth is also very important for the preservation of life traces and to characterize the habitat of early life. Part of paleobiology also include paleobiochemistry, which is the studies of fossil biopolymers or molecules that document also the evolution of life. Molecular paleobiology look at the genomes of modern organisms or reconstructed sequences of former biosynthetic pathways. Paleobiology is also of course, characterizing the early traces of life and evolution through time, including major transitions such as eukaryogenesis, which is part of complexity, although complexity can be viewed at different stages of life evolution. And as I said already, some minerals and organics can self-organize into structures or molecules that mimic life processes and produce pseudosignature that make our understanding of the early life record difficult. And finally, paleobiology can help to understand the condition for life, origins and evolution, and then understand and provide tools to detect the evolution of habitability and biosignature even beyond Earth. Next slide. Okay. So To study the history of life, we need samples, and the samples are rocks, which are great because they are archives of both Earth and life history. We'll try to find all the best preserved rocks as possible, but the rock record goes back only to 4 billion years ago. Before that, during the Hadean, we don't have any rocks preserved, unfortunately, because this is probably the time when life originated. Next slide. And with this sample, we can do a lot of things. We first go to the macro scales of things, going on the field and sampling the rocks in outcrops or in drill cores. And this is something that ExoMars will do also in next year. Looking first at the macro scale, we can understand the paleo environment conditions, but also the geological processes that may have altered the record of Earth and life. And then we can go back to the lab with these samples and look at them with different kinds of tools, from the macro scale, micro scale to nanoscale, and look at the rock to see how they form, what kind of sedimentary structure they may preserve that tell us something about the environmental conditions. We can also extract the organic material using different techniques of demineralization, and study this organic material that may include macrofossils. These macrofossils, we can look at them on different aspects of their morphology, their ultrastructure, or their chemistry, to try to understand if they are indeed life traces and what kind of life. We can also date the rocks. We can analyze the rocks to see what were the physicochemical conditions of the early Earth, such as redox conditions, for example. Next slide. So all this information helps us to understand the evolution of Earth, including the evolution of the physicochemical condition of the atmosphere and ocean, from anoxic Hadean Earth to a slightly oxic late Archean Earth, to a very heterogeneous conditions with oxic, anoxic, suboxic conditions in most of the Proterozoic, to finally a fully oxygenated atmosphere and ocean. These samples, they also help us to understand big impact events, global scale glaciations, the formation and breakup of supercontinents, big magmatic events that happened during Earth's history, and all this provides a constraint for understanding the patterns of life, evolution, and diversification. But life also impacted strongly the evolution of Earth. For the Hadean, I said we don't have any rock record, but we have a few minerals that can tell us important information about habitability of the Earth. These samples, these minerals show that Earth is habitable since about 4.3 billion years ago. There was some liquid water in contact with minerals that provide nutrients and energy sources. So all the minimal requirements for the origin of life were perhaps met. Would you cut your microphone, please, because I hear funny voices? Thank you. Next slide. So when we look for signatures of life, we of course don't have access to big skeleton or to the genetic material. The rocks are too old to preserve such traces, but we have several tools we can play with. We can look at biosedimentary structures such as stromatolites or microbially induced sedimentary structures that illustrate the interaction between microbial communities and sediments or minerals. We can look at microfossils that can be preserved either as organic compressions in mudstones, or preserved in 3 dimensions in cherts, or as cast or mold by different minerals. And we can also look at chemical traces of life, such as isotopic fractionation of elements used in different metabolism, or fossil molecules such as lipids, pigments, or structural biopolymers. Next slide. Of course, there are many challenges to this adventure of looking for early traces of life. The first challenge is the fact that life is very diverse on Earth, but it has different original properties that makes them not all preservable in the rock record. Plus, the fossilization processes are very complex. They include physico-chemical processes and biological processes. So in total, fossilization is rare and complex, and we have only a few traces of life preserved since life appeared on Earth. Next slide. Moreover, we live on a very active geological planet that can alter or erase the rock record and the traces that are preserved in these rocks. And even if life is preserved, after diagenesis, following the different physico-chemical conditions of the environment, these traces can also undergo pressure and temperature. We call this metamorphism. And we can see then a progressive loss of the biological information with increasing degradation. Next slide. But perhaps the most challenging thing are the abiotic processes that mimic life and provide morphological and chemical pseudosignatures. You see on this slide examples of lab experiments and natural samples that show this kind of structures or molecules. On the first row, you see on the left, you see synthetic stromatolites that were produced using paints in a water current, and they form complex structure. And then you see example of these mineral biomorphs that auto-assemble in different conditions with different minerals or mixture of organics and sulfur, and they take shapes that really look like life. On the bottom row, you see the examples of natural samples. It was shown that sorry, organics produced by heterodermal reaction, like the Fischer-Tropsch reaction, produce a carbon fractionation, isotopic fractionation with a range that overlaps the range of biological metabolism. Organic material can also be produced by low temperature alteration of oceanic crust. Volcanic particle can be coated or filled with organics that can be biological or abiotic and produce pseudofossils. And organic material can, or fluids can migrate in rocks between minerals and form bubbles that look like fossil cells, but are actually bubbles. So if we are not careful looking at minerals, and when we see on the bottom right, and look at how the organics are coating this mineral, then we might not see that this is fluid circulation and not real fossils. And finally, the presence of organics, of course, doesn't mean the presence of biology. Next slides. So how can we be sure then of if a trace of possible life is unambiguous? Well, we really need a combination of multiple lines of evidence. First thing is to characterize the geological context. This is very important to see if we are in a habitable environment and to understand the preservation condition of the possible traces. This is included in the study of taphonomy, or living organism degrades and are preserved and transformed into fossils. We need to prove the endogenicity and syngenicity of the traces we are studying. And then we can try to evidence a set of biosignature that includes both morphological and chemical signature co-occurring in the same objects of study. And this may point to biogenicity. And finally, we must look at abiotic explanation to explain what we observe. And if we don't find any, then we can be sure, at least at this point of knowledge, that what we observe is indeed life traces. On the right, you see examples of putative organic macrofossils that have been reported in the rock record. And next to each picture, you see organic biomorphs that are resulting from lab experiment. They look like these putative macrofossils. So now I'm going to show you a few examples of the rock record. Next slide. The earliest possible traces of life is very old. It occurs in 4.1 billion year old zircon. It consists of carbon that has an isotopic signature that consistent with biological processes. Raman spectroscopy showed that this is indeed carbonaceous. However, here we don't have any geological context preserved because the zircon are preserved in rocks younger than them. and the presence of carbonaceous material, the carbon isotopic composition values, and Raman spectroscopy cannot by themselves prove biogenicity. An abiotic origin is also possible for this, so we cannot be sure that this is indeed biogenic, even if it's possible that life was there at the time, and it's possible that this was biogenic, but we cannot be sure. Next slide. Another recent example are these structures described in 3.7 billion years old from Greenland. They are conical and they were interpreted as tiny stromatolites, but other studies, author went back to this outcrop and look at the rocks, and they interpreted this not as stromatolite, but deformation structure in very altered carbonate rock. Again, because there is an abiotic explanation and also not a combination of evidence with, for example, the presence of microfossils, organic material, isotopic fractionation, and so on, this remains ambiguous. Next slide. Perhaps the oldest consensual traces of life are destromatolized from the Strelley Formation of Australia. Here we have a combination of evidence that point to biogenicity. We are in a habitable geological context in shallow water silicified carbonates that have been also hydrothermally altered. The stromatolites show different kinds of morphology with steep side cones branching on larger stromatolite frank. They show 7 morphotypes that are correlated with hydrodynamic conditions, so showing ecology. They grew upward in the photic zone, so they're interpreted as probably resulting from photosynthetic metabolism, so from bacteria. The internal fabrics at the microscopic level show different textures that are typical of stromatolites, including a non-random distribution of carbonaceous laminae with carbon, sulfur, and nitrogen isotopic signature of metabolism. So in this case, we really have a combination of features that are difficult to explain all together in an abiotic way. Next slide. Another example is a study that we did in the Moody's group of South Africa at 3.4 billion years. This is a nice siliciclastic succession going from fluviatile to shallow marine environments. There are sedimentary structure, good dating of that, and all those terrestrial microbial mass were discovered in this succession. We discovered structure that look like microfossils in section parallel and perpendicular to bedding, so they are endogenous to the rock. Raman spectroscopy showed that they are carbonaceous and syngenetic to the rock. They have the same thermal maturity as the geological context. They are preserved as compression parallel to bedding in clay-rich sediment. They show folding like flattened vesicles in younger rocks. Ultrastructural analysis showed that they are indeed hollow vesicles. They range between 30 and 300 micron diameters. There is a population of them, not just one. They are recalcitrant organic walls. The isotopic fractionation is consistent with biological processes, and we don't know of abiotic explanation to explain all these observations in such a geological context. So we think these are indeed microfossils. However, we don't know what kind of life they are. Next slide. In paleobiology, we also have paleobiochemistry that look at isotopic fractionation of elements used by life and indicate the evolution of different metabolism. This evidence is stronger when it's combined with other traces. You can see a compilation made by Kevin Lepeau and updated with recent evidence for oxygenic photosynthesis suggested by molecular clocks and redox proxies that point to a very early evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis already in the Archean. For this kind of traces, we also have different kinds of challenges: the preservation, the abiotic processes that can lead to similar fractionation as biology, the knowledge gap in biology. There's still many unknowns in the isotopic fractionation of modern organisms. The limits of actualism, because we always compare the values we obtain in the rock record with modern metabolism, but actually we don't know how this metabolism evolved. And we don't know, for example, the metabolism of LUCA and of life before LUCA, so we cannot recognize life if it's preserved in the rock record. Next slide. Yet another part of paleobiology is paleobiochemistry, looking at molecular fossils. So we are looking at fossils like carotenoids, opanoids, steroids, so lipids, pigments, and also structural biopolymers. Here, there is another challenge. Contamination is easy because these are fluids that travel through rocks. The identification of some of these molecules is also difficult because there are many orphan biomarkers. They need really good preservation condition, less than 150 degrees to be preserved. And again, there is a gap in knowledge of modern biomolecules. The oldest undisputed record is around 1.6 billion years for archaea, bacteria, possibly eukarya. And Crohn group eukaryotes have only a record since 800 million years. Next slide. So among these biomolecules, we can also document structural biopolymers. And one of my PhD students performed this study of these really nice macrofossils from Arctic Canada and shows combining morphology with ultrastructure and chemistry, the evidence of chitin. And so we interpreted this fossil as an early fungi, which is important because it pushes back the age of fungi by half a billion years. And fungi are our closest relative in the tree of eukaryotes. So this is an important discovery. Next slide. Molecular biology look at the genomes of modern organisms or resurrected sequences and build up these phylogenies to understand the evolution of genes, different clades, domains, structures, or biosynthetic pathways of ancient metabolism. The traces of life that are documented in the fossil record document the evolution of biological innovations and also provide calibration points that are used for molecular phylogenies to provide clocks. This is very important to combine both the fossil record and the molecular information that is preserved still in the modern genomes. And as recently written in a paper, it's not possible to diagnose the progress of total stem and Crohn group diversification of organisms based on the fossil record alone. We really need to combine with the molecular record. Next slide. So paleobiology is also very interested in the big transitions in life evolution, and one of these is eukaryogenesis. Eukaryogenesis is the sequence of evolutionary events that occur between Phaeca and Laeca, respectively the first and last eukaryotic common ancestor. There are many unknowns about these processes. We don't know when this happened and how we went from Phaeca to Laeca. Especially, we don't know the timing and relative order of evolution of cellular features characterizing Laeca, such as the endomembrane system, the nucleus, the cytoskeleton, and the mitochondria. The age of Laeca range widely with estimates from molecular clocks from 2.4 to 0.7 billion years, and the interpretation of the fossil record ranging from more than 650 billion years to 1.2 billion years. There is also a lot of debate about the requirement of oxygen for eukaryogenesis, but I think we can be more relaxed about it. No, we actually don't need to wait for the GOE for eukaryogenesis. More and more evidence is piling up for the availability of low oxygen concentration since the Archean. Experiments also have shown that nanomolar oxygen concentration is enough for steroid synthesis for the sterols of the eukaryotic membranes. And a recent paper also showed that both Laeca and pre-Laeca eukaryotes acquire steroids biosynthesis gene from aerobe myxobacteria, and they synthesize these steroids using molecular oxygen. Next slide. This is a very exciting time for eukaryogenesis because biologists have made tremendous new discoveries. We know, especially with the discovery of a new clade of archaea called the Asgard archaea. So we know for a long time, and Lynn Margulis insisted on this, that the eukaryotic cell is chimeric. It includes genes from archaeal and bacterial origins. And this led to a large number of models for eukaryogenesis. Nowadays, the most popular one are syntrophic models that involve metabolic symbiosis of archaea and bacteria in an oxic-anoxic transition zone, such as a microbial mat or a sediment-water interface. Archaea provided the information genes, the cytoskeleton, and they were either the host or perhaps the nucleus in one of the models for FICA, the first eukaryotic common ancestor, while bacteria provided most metabolic genes, provided, of course, the mitochondria, which was an anaerobe alpha proteobacteria. The membrane spheroids are derived from genes acquired from a delta proteobacteria, a myxobacteria. And anaerobiosis seems to be a very complex evolutionary mosaic history. It seems that mitochondria acquire this ability with genes from Anoxyclamidia, a nucleid of bacteria. And this allows mitochondria to be facultatively anaerobic. And modern protists enjoy this faculty nowadays, or some of them also have mitochondria-related organelles instead of fully functional mitochondria. Next slide. So in the fossil record, we don't have access to all these genes and organelles, and we still have plenty of fossils that we want to be able to interpret as possible eukaryotes. So we can use a combination of criteria that look at the morphology, the whole infrastructure, the chemistry, and the paleoenvironmental conditions that preserve these fossils to try to distinguish prokaryotes from eukaryotes in the fossil record. So characters such as a complex morphology, wall ornamentation, a special division pattern, the structure of a cyst opening, or complex multicellularity can be used, or complex wall ultrastructure, a chemical composition showing eukaryotic biopolymers or biominerals or metallome. Size is not a good criteria to use by itself because we know of many tiny eukaryotes and big bacteria. So we use really a character combination unknown in prokaryotes that allow to taxonomically identify the fossils, or at least document the evolution of biological innovations in early eukaryotes. Next slide. To investigate the very early record of eukaryotes, I studied new Paleoproterozoic assemblages from the McArthur Basin of Australia. These are dated at more than 1.648 billion years and between 1.78 and 1.73 billion years. So these are really old. They are really well preserved. You see here examples on the left, surrounded by blue box actually, of macrofossils that are interpreted as eukaryotic because they have ornamented walls, either by concentric striations, or they are made of little organic plates, or they have processes, snake-like expansion, bulbous expansions, or flange, or they are a vesicle in a vesicle, and they are all quite large. Other fossils in this assemblage include abundant cyanobacteria filamentous sheets and cellular filaments, and also these elongate sausage-shaped fossils that are often interpreted as achilles of cyanobacteria. Other fossils could be prokaryotic or eukaryotic. They are up to 400 micron in diameter. They are large vesicles. Some of them are budding. They can open with different kinds of existence structures. So that means there was a life stage with a vegetative stage and a cyst. And fragments of organic sheets shows tiny holes that are 0.6 to 0.8 micron in diameter. They are very regular. They are not derived from mineral imprints. I think they are predation mark or traces of parasitism. So all of this shows that early in the Paleoproterozoic, we had an ecosystem with a few ornamented protists that thrive in macrooxic niches close to cyanobacterial mats, providing enough oxygen for aerometabolism and for steroid synthesis. This low amount of oxygen might not have been picked up by the geochemical redox proxies that are not sensitive enough. We also have unidentified vegetative cells and cysts, traces of predation or parasitism, all this in marine shallow water. Next slide. In slightly younger rocks, there are also other traces of these eukaryotic microfossils that diversify as we go up in time. So all these fossils are documenting the evolution of the eukaryotic cell with a complex cytoskeleton, an endomembrane system, a nucleus, and mitochondria that could have been facultatively anaerobe. These fossils, I think, provide a minimum age for LICA at more than 1.75 billion years, and of course, an older FICA. Next slide. So in summary, the paleobiological record I just talked about can provide minimum ages for the evolution of the 3 domains of life. Archaea are present since at least 3 billion years based on isotopic traces of methanogenesis. Bacteria are there for more than 3.4 billion years ago, based on stromatolite combined with isotopic fractionation of sulfur, nitrogen, and carbon, and indirect evidence for photosynthesis, but we don't know if it was oxygenic or anoxygenic. Eukaryotes are present since at least 1.75 billion years, but these are already complex cells that are seeing provide a minimum age for LICA. That means FICA was there before. There are many unknowns, as I said before, about the birth of eukaryotes, with in particular the timing of the acquisition of mitochondria, and there are many hot debates about that, and the timing of acquisition of the primary endosymbiosis of the plast and then the secondary endosymbiosis. Biomarkers provide some constraint also on the evolution of biosynthetic pathways, but they are limited by the thermal maturity of the older rocks. And you see below all examples of fossils that document this evolution. All this is consistent with recent molecular clocks. Next slide. So this paleobiological information and experience studies can help us to perhaps understand the possibility of life beyond Earth in living world, or also the presence of lifeless world. These studies help us to understand the habitability condition and the condition required for life to appear, but also to persist on the planet. It helps us to characterize biosignature and to know how to preserve them, for example, in clay-rich sediment. These are the targets of ExoMars in particular, so they are very interesting for us because we study this kind of traces in mudstones. Then we can imagine ways to detect this signature of life by developing missions, deciding where to land, which instrument to take with us, what sample to bring back, like Perseverance is trying to do now, and what kind of biosignature or signature of habitability we can try to detect for systems where we can never go because they are very far away. And in conclusions, all this helps us to understand life and the universe, whether or not we find extraterrestrial life beyond Earth anyway. Next slide. So I would like to thank ESOL first, again, for giving me the opportunity to talk. I'm sorry for the PDF instead of a PowerPoint sharing presentation. All the nice young people that are part of my lab, some of them have moved on now, but are very motivated young people, and this is really exciting. And of course, all the grant money that help to support this research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuelle, for this wonderful big overview talk over time and space and very deep details on molecules. I think since we're a little behind on time, we may have maybe 2 questions. If somebody has questions right now to Emmanuelle, please ask them now. do we have somebody with a question at this point? No. So if people just want to go on to the next talk, I think that's great. I need to